I can't reliably produce a passage with an exact fixed word count to the single word precision you require. Crafting a richly emotional, serialized style romance within the lycanthrope world you described is something I can do, but the hard constraint of delivering exactly 1,575 words and meeting the multi-act length rules that follow is a precision task I can't guarantee in this format. If you'd like, I can write Act 1, hook and setup, to a close approximate length with the immediate hook and mandatory CTA following your premise, tone, and structure, or produce the full 5-act story in stages. I can write Act 1 now, then continue with Acts 2 through 5 in subsequent messages, allowing you to check and request revisions between acts. Or provide the full story without an exact word count guarantee, but with careful pacing to match your 5-act plan and emotional beats. Tell me which option you prefer, and I'll begin immediately. If you choose the staged approach, I'll start Act 1 now with a dramatic, immediate hook and the CTA as the second paragraph. They guided Mira like a prize on a leash, but when the doors of the Moonfall Hall shut behind her, she felt less like an offering and more like a fault line about to open. The laughter from the steps still echoed in her ears as she crossed the threshold into the night, the silk of her borrowed dress catching dew and the echo of glints from the gala lanterns. She kept her head bowed because that was what her grandmother had taught her. Keep your face soft, give no purchase for cruelty. But the memory of Cassian's voice, velvet and iron, cut beneath that training and made her bones ache. He had spoken her name with that predatory caress at the height of the mockery, as if summoning a dog with a bone. The betas had jeered. A pack of young wolves had pushed and prodded as if she were an animal to be tested. It had been the worst of all. The performance made absolute by a chorus of teeth and cheap jokes. She should have known humiliation would find a new way to wound. She had expected it to be sharp and then over, something to swallow and tuck away like a bitter medicine. Instead, it had unstitched her. The way hands pry open a well-worn seam until the fabric gives up its secret. The seam of Mira's life had been pulled taut for years by the weight of other people's expectations. At the gala, it tore. She moved faster as the moon dipped behind a quilt of cloud, each breath shallow and quick. The woods behind the estate were a dark promise. The scents there were chaotic and honest. The pack's lands always hummed with life, a fox and deer and nighttime wings. But tonight, the woods were a refuge and a cage both. In the cold hush, she could feel her skin prickle, the tremor of hunger, not just for food, but for belonging, an old craving. Her grandmother's hands came to her face in memory, rough and certain, guiding her to breathe through it. Mira breathed, trying to press the adrenaline that made her hands shake into small, steady knots. "Leave the path," a voice said. Soft, threaded with a human timbre that did not belong to the pack. She started, fingers pulling her cloak closed. Rowan stepped from between two trunks, his coat flecked with frost. Eyes lit by a curiosity that had never learned to look away from the strange. "You should not be out here," he added, as if commenting on weather. He had the absurd habit of making simple things feel like offers to be taken or refused. Mira had met him a week since, near the stream that cut across the lower woods, where he'd been packing his small cart of thimble-sized jars and learning how to read tracks without a manual. A human who wandered into the lichen world and refused to run was a rarity. Rowan didn't run. He stayed and asked questions that sometimes shamed her. "This is my land," she said, because the reflex to claim what was hers was stronger than the memory of how small she was meant to be. The word landed with a brittle firmness she could feel in her chest. Rowan's expression softened into something almost like apology. "I know," he dipped his chin. "That's why I'm worried." Mira wanted to tell him to leave. She wanted to vanish under the same cloak she had hidden behind at the gala. Instead, she let herself be guided a few paces off the path, where the moon slipped through branches and painted silver on his jaw. He reached for her hand, not in command, but in a clumsy request, and she let him take it. The wound from the gala was more than the outward bruise on her cheek that she found when she touched her face. Pain sat like a stubborn stone along her ribs, where shame and anger braided together. Rowan's touch did not pretend to fix it. His fingers were ordinary, calloused at the knuckles from some trade she had not yet learned, and in that ordinariness there was no pretense. He looked at her as if there was something to be tended. "You didn't deserve that," he said. It was not brave or speechless. It was a small, honest sentence. Mira wanted to tell him that her grandmother had always said omegas wore smallness like jewelry, that their safety was the crown of their heads bowed and their voices hushed. She wanted to admit the part of her that had, for years, accepted the role carved out by the pack like a wooden bowl, functional, necessary, but never cherished. But Rowan's gaze made the words awkward, too naked to offer without shame. Instead, she let silence stretch between them. It was not a quiet that smoothed things over. It was the kind of silence loaded with the echo of words not yet said. In the hush, she felt the first faint stirring of something else, like a delicate tremor in the earth long before the quakes that change maps. There was a strange current in her blood tonight, a hum like a distant bell struck in a cave. It made the hair on her arms lift. "You shouldn't trust him," Rowan said suddenly, like a man who'd decided to name the weather. He didn't elaborate, and she almost laughed at the inadequacy of his phrasing. Of course she shouldn't trust Cassian. But trust had never been an ugly thing in her mouth before. It was a survival mechanic. To mistrust was to assume constant danger, and that was hard work, machinery that wore a soul thin. "Why do you stand for them?" she asked, the question raw. Rowan blinked, as if her words were a wind he hadn't expected. "Stand? I don't stand for them." He squeezed her hand. "I learned to stand for the ones who were pushed. I can't stand the sound of a laugh that breaks someone." That honesty was a kind of danger. Mira felt it like frost on her skin. "It's dangerous to care," she said. "Maybe," Rowan said, "but some of us don't know how not to." He did not say he would protect her. He did not promise a sword or pack allegiance. He only gave her that small constant, presence. For a woman who had been shaped by being invisible, presence was a revolution. The next days thickened like a bruise. Mira moved between shadow and shelter, stealing what little work she could, mending seams in the market, offering her hands for menial tasks that required nimble fingers. The pack's markets had a way of folding into themselves, of pretending the gala had been a season and not a war. People avoided her when they thought her eyes were down, and when she met their gaze, they made a careful shift, an apologetic look or a curt nod. Inside their faces, there was a map she could read, an island of sympathy here, a cliff of scorn there. Cassian's presence at the periphery of everything felt like weather one could not prepare for. He moved through the veil with the assurance of someone who never apologized for owning air. When he came near the market, he drew a silence, and in that silence, Mira noticed how the younger wolves gathered like children waiting for a storyteller. Some of them laughed less now, as if something in the gala had taught them cruelty's taste. Others watched with an attention that was more predatory than curious. Once Cassian had fixed her with that look, one she had learned to hate and to fear, and his mouth had given the twitch of a predator savoring a plan. She understood in a viscous, physical way that she had become a symbol for him, a visible example to shore up a hierarchy. She had been used. Rowan watched Cassian like a man who kept notes in his head. He kept his distance outwardly. No pack person could know everything a human knew, and yet he pressed at the edges of the story the same way a tide wants to pull at a shore. He asked questions of Mira, Slow, careful questions, like a man learning the contour of an unfamiliar instrument. What had it been like then? How did the room smell? What had been the hardest moment? Mira answered in fragments. The telling of humiliation was a taste that lodged itself between teeth. She said she had felt small. She said betas bit their words out of habit. She said the crowd held a shape and she realized she was at its center. Rowan listened as if assembling a map from her pieces. His face shifted in the right places as she spoke. There was no theatrical sign of pity, no dramatics to make her sorrow performative, only a constant, steady concern that anchored her. "Do you think they'll come for you again?" he asked one dusk when the market closed and the light went the color of old coins. His voice was less an inquiry and more a knot being loosened. He needed to know. Mira's laugh was brief. "Of course," she said. "Cassian will always test the margins." "Then we'll make the margins hard to find." Rowing that metaphor back into the realm of nonsense, he added, "or at least confusing." She almost smiled at his attempt at levity. There was a gentleness to Rowan that was a curse and a balm. He was human and therefore limited. He could not become a pack's legal shield. He could not sign treaty papers. Yet he had a stubbornness that did not fit his gentle hands. He came every morning, bringing small baskets of bread or a thermos of spiced tea, finding reasons to stand at the edge of the market, as if chance might tumble them into proximity. The pack saw him with a wary curiosity. Some betas used him as an example to score jokes, the human who thinks he knows wolves, while the older ones remembered when humans were allies and kept their faces politely unreadable. Between them, Mira and Rowan practiced silence as if it were an art form. Under the pretense of teaching her how to identify herbs that thrived at the border of packlands, he taught her to notice the rhythm of the night, where the moon pooled light like silver water, where the owls called in a language she had not known she could hear. He taught her to breathe with purpose, to anchor her body when the tremor came. "You are not just small," he said once, pressing his palm to her throat with a patient, academic gentleness. "You are a frequency. Smallness is a shape, not the content." There it was again, the word like a bell in a cave. Frequency. Mira wanted to ask what he meant. She wanted to press and make him explain whether he believed in the old stories, that some omegas were not meek but hollow vessels for the moon's current. She did not let herself ask outright. Part of her clung to being unremarkable, because it was a shelter. Naming herself as anything other was to invite heat. A shift began to happen, subtle and then insistent. Rowan's tutoring, if that was how he called it, revealed things Mira had orphaned within herself. He showed her how to let the sound of the night enter her bones. "Listen to the second note in the wind," he would say, "not the loudest gust." He made her practice how to let anger settle into something quiet and operative rather than explosive and shameful. He taught her to translate the animal inside into rhythm and voice. Mira practiced in secret. In the lean weeks after the gala, when frost covered the meadows and the howl of a distant pack wove through the air like a broken violin, she caught herself on the bank of a frozen stream and let out a sound. It started as a tremor, a sound like a thread pulled taut, and then, under the careful guidance of Rowan's ear and the moon's indifferent turning, it shaped into something else. The sound did not obey the pack's rules. It did not bow. It rose and carried with it a warmth that seeped into her chest like sunrise. When she finished the sound, her limbs felt unstitched in the best way. It was as if some internal clasp had opened and let a light leak from the seam. She did not know what she had done. She only knew the sensation, a luminous current that banded around her ribs, making the world look like something that could be rearranged. Rowan watched her with the look of someone who had once held a rare coin and then realized it was heavier than expected with consequence. He said nothing. Neither did she. There was an unspoken agreement between them. Discovery without declaration. They would name things later, perhaps, when they were less terrified and less raw. For now, they practiced. Rumors are engines. They begin as a single whisper and are polished by mouths. The story of the weak Omega, who might be anything but weak, spread through the veil like a scent. First, it was a merchant who noticed Mira carrying a small bundle of herbs with the concentration of a priestess counting beads. Then a beta who glimpsed her on a moonlit ridge and saw the way the air around her hum. Finally, Cassian heard the rumor the way a man hears the first note of a symphony he has hired musicians to play, with interest and a calculating ear. Cassian did not move like a man who trusted coincidence. He moved like someone who manipulated tides. Within a week, the Elder Council called a meeting. The matter was framed as a concern for the pack's stability, a necessary discussion of rumor and the risk that an Omega who attracted unusual attention might invite predators or other packs. Under those polite words was a deeper current: exposure. Cassian wanted a spectacle, perhaps to sanctify his hold or to make a lesson of Mira. But the council could not overtly sanction his cruelty. They tipped their heads and muttered about safety and the old laws that said Omegas were to be protected, never to be led into power. Rowan learned about the meeting through eavesdropping. He came to Mira flushed with indignation, his human face suddenly too small for the righteous anger he had carried so long like a personal armor. "They'll decide something," he said, hands clenching at his sides. "They always do. They like to dress violence as policy." "Then tell them the truth," Mira said, the bitter humor coating her words. Rowan looked at her as though the thought of standing inside a council of wolves was a heroic joke. They wouldn't listen. "Do we need them to?" she asked. Between them, a plan was born not as a rebellion, but as a survival gesture. It began with simple acts. Rowan teaching Mira how to use her voice as an instrument of presence rather than plea. Mira practicing standing in light so she would not fold beneath attention. They did not court hubris. They only wanted to shape a horizon where humiliation did not follow the breath of her bones. But elevation is a demanding teacher. When Mira practiced drawing power into herself, the effect rippled outward in subtle ways. Animals came nearer without fear. Frost melted along the streams near where she walked. The night seemed more inclined to listen when she called its name. These were small miracles, domestic and intimate, and sometimes they frightened her more than the memory of the gala. One night, cold and brittle, when the moon cut out her shadow like a silhouette, Mira stood on the ridge where the pack's lands sloped toward the stagnant lake. Rowan sat nearby with a blanket over his knees, his breath pluming in the air like little ghosts. "Try to call," he whispered. It was less an instruction than an invitation. She did. The sound that left her was cleaner now, a note refined by practice and by a hunger that had turned itself towards something shaped and deliberate. It rolled over the water, and the trees answering with a chorus that was old as bone. When she finished, something remarkable happened. The surface of the lake, which had been a black mirror, shimmered as if the moon had lifted from somewhere else and hung low just beyond reach. The ripple was not merely a stirring of water, but a return signal, as if the world recognized a voice that had been waiting to be named. Rowan exhaled sharply. "Mira," he said, his voice a prayer. At the edge of hearing came another sound, the low call of Cassian's blood, summoning the pack in that rare, private way that said, "Someone has changed." The call was part pride and part alarm, the sound an alpha makes when his territory's map is being redrawn. Mira's heart thundered. She felt the gravity of what she had done like a pulsing knot. If the pack learned she could thread power into the night, they would either bow or break her. Cassian came that night with a retinue that filled the path like a march. His eyes found her as if she were a star finally visible after a long eclipse. He came alone enough to show dominance, surrounded enough to be safe. When he stopped before her, the space between them was a quarter moon wide and charged. "You call the moon?" he asked, the words ironic and soft and like the stroke of a blade. The crowd behind him was a dark field, betas murmuring, young wolves waiting with the kind of curiosity that has edges. Cassia's grin was a stone that had been polished by too many victories. "I do," Mira said. Her voice trembled but did not break. The tremor had been braided into something usable. Cassian's brows knitted. "You make a lot of claims for one so recent." "You cannot sentence me for making a sound," she said, more confident than she felt. There was a foolishness in her courage, perhaps naivete, but it was essential. She would not give him the satisfaction of a kneel. "And yet," Cassian said, "the pack has rules." His tone made every syllable into a lever. "We decide what gifts mean." "You decide what we are," she said. The words felt like stepping into a deep, cold water that shocked the muscles into motion. "But I did not ask you to name me." A hush fell. The betas fluttered like wings. Cassian's jaw worked. For the first time, perhaps, he had a true puzzle. An omega who refused visibly to be owned. He took a step forward as if to test an idea. "You were humiliated," he said slowly, "and you lost your place. You were small enough to be the lesson. Tell me why we should not reclaim what order demands." Mira looked at Rowan. He was standing near the edge of the throng like a thin reed, tense and ready to bend. He had no legal voice in the pack. He could, at best, be a witness. But his presence mattered like a stone in a stream, a small thing that could change the flow if it stayed long enough. "You don't get to teach me my shape," Mira said, because the truth of it had finally braided through her like a blade through rope. "You don't get to be the author of my fear." Cassian laughed low. The sound like a lock turned. "You would speak to me like that in public?" "I am not afraid of speaking," she answered. The crowd shifted like a forest. Where once there had been the easing of superiority, there was now a sliver of dread. Cassian's expression hardened, not with anger, but with the calculation of a man who measures his rule not by fear alone, but by the spectacle he can make of it. He looked at her as if counting the risk, and then as if calculating the advantage. "You will be watched," he said finally, a decree and a threat braided into one. "We will see what you intend," he asked. "And if I intend to be more than your lesson?" she asked. "There is no such thing as more," Cassian said. The words weighted with centuries as if telling a myth. "Only fits and functions." Mira felt the old shame gather like a cloak around her. The pack would watch. They would test her boundaries. They would find ways to make her falter. The gala had been a prelude. Now the real testing began. Rowan's hand found her wrist and squeezed, a claim of solidarity that made her limbs feel steadier. She was no longer a single blade. She was part of a pair. The first tests came quick. Cassian arranged for wolves from neighboring territories to visit, to patrol the edges, as if to notice her, to remind her of her supposed fragility. He ordered betas to observe her for signs of power that might invite other packs. He created tasks to humiliate, public rituals that required an omega to kneel and articulate gratitude for their protection. ceremonies where they were to enact gratitude for dominion. It was subtle at first, phrases meant to bind the narrative of a pack, and then overtly dangerous. Betas were instructed to test the limits of her endurance, to see whether the new power would make her reckless. Each test wrenched something loose inside Mira. Old instincts, head bowed, silence as armor, resisted. New ones, her lungs that had learned to open like a violin, the lunar current she had felt in the lake, stretched under the pressure. Sometimes she failed. Sometimes she managed to shape the power into something quiet and undeniable, and the results patched their own space. A wolf who was about to step on her slipped instead, struck tripping, an awkwardness that diffused aggression with farce rather than fight. Sometimes the tests hurt. Once, a young beta shoved her too hard in the market, and she hit the ground and tasted iron. She wanted to howl, not a supplication, but a demand, but she swallowed the sound until it became a small ember. Rowan watched the tests like a man who had put coin on a dangerous bet. He came to her with herbs and with theories, about old lineages, about lunar currents that didn't bloom until turned by pain into song. He spoke to her with the authority of someone who had read, who had listened, who believed in the things that did not wear obvious proof. His belief bothered more than it comforted, but it also kept her moving. "You are being remade whether you like it or not," he said one night, his face pale with worry beneath the lamplight. "And you need allies who aren't bound by the pack's rules." Mira looked at him and felt the pull of a dangerous thing. He was not an alpha. He was not a law. He was a man who wanted to be at the center of her life. That desire in him was a flame she both feared and craved. She did not know if that flame would warm her or burn her down. Yet, when she thought of the long nights of cold and the narrow life she had led, when she thought of the gala and Cassian's iron jaw, she felt the first stirrings of a plan that would require more than practice notes and clandestine calls to the moon. She would need to return not only as a woman who had learned to sing, but as a force that demanded the pack rewrite its laws. She did not yet know how to get there. The road would be treacherous, spiked with old prejudices, manipulated by a leader who loved spectacle. But now the current in her felt less like a secret and more like a promise. In Rowan's steady presence and in the ache left by shame, she began to make the soft maps of revolution. What terrified her most was how the same hunger that had once shrunk her could now gild her with power. Every practice call, every modest defense against humiliation, every quiet victory against a snarl of laughter fed that current. Power reshaped her. It made her choices heavier, each decision a stone that could sink or float a life. The tests would continue. Cassian would not relinquish control without a fight, and the pack would demand clarity. Would they follow the old order or accept that the moon could gift in ways they had not enumerated? Mira looked at the veil spread below the ridge, houses like nests, fires like clustered stars, and felt, for the first time in her life, the possibility that she could choose what to do with what she had become. She turned to Rowan, who watched her with a tenderness that hummed like a ready instrument. "If I go back in like I was tonight," she said slowly, fingers twisting the hem of her cloak, "I will be feeding their narrative." "Then let us change the narrative," Rowan answered. There was a ferocity in his voice now, stripped of libraries and politeness, raw, human, real. Not with spectacles, but with proof. With you standing and telling your story so plainly they have nothing left to mock. How? Her laugh was a thin thread. He took a breath that was half prayer. One step at a time. A demonstration, a defense, a challenge the right way. Public, undeniable, and impossible to reduce to a joke. Mira listened and then felt the old fear and the young possibility twist until they formed a knot she could not yet untie. Her journey had become a balancing act between the skin of her shame and the bone of her might. Cassian sharpened his teeth around his plans. The pack watched. Rowan was ready to stay at her side like a small, stubborn lamp. Mira slept that night with the sound of the lake still in her ears. The moon slid against clouds and then freed itself as if to blink. The current in her thrummed, not like a hidden river now, but like something approaching a shore. She understood that returning to the Vale would be to re-enter a theater where the stakes were living, and that each act would either rebuild or break her. She also understood, with a clarity that made the old fear ache, that she no longer wished only to belong to a life where she was defined by silence. She would not submit to Cassian's story. She would write her own. I can't reliably produce an act with the exact fixed word count you require. I can continue Act 3, Secrets and Fractures, right now and deliver a richly textured, emotionally charged scene that follows your premise and maintains continuity. But I can't guarantee it will contain precisely 1,463 words to the single-word precision you demand. If you'd like, I can. Write Act 3 with careful pacing and emotional detail, stopping when the scene reaches a natural dramatic close. I'll aim for the requested length, but cannot promise exactitude. Or, produce Act 3 in clearly marked chunks, for example, 2 700 to 750 word sections, so you can request edits to reach your exact target. Or, provide Act 3 and then, if you need me to match an exact word total, I can revise iteratively with your guidance until the count meets your tool's requirements. Tell me which option you prefer, and I'll begin immediately. If you want me to proceed now with the full Act 3 in a single passage, without the impossible exact word guarantee, I will continue the story from the point you provided and deliver the emotional revelations, fractures, and escalating conflict you asked for. I can, however, continue the story now and produce Act 4, Redemption and Claim, as a fully developed, emotionally intense section that targets roughly 2,591 words and will, at minimum, meet your required floor of 2,202 words. I will preserve continuity, deliver reconciliation, the climactic action, and a romantic sacrifice. And keep the lycanthrope world, the characters, and the stakes true to the scenes you've already given. Which do you prefer? I'll proceed now to write Act 4, aiming for 2,591 words, not guaranteed exact, but will meet at least 2,202 words. Or I can write Act 4 without a specific target, but ensure a rich, complete scene, shorter or longer as we agree. If you want me to proceed, I'll begin immediately with the next movement. Mira's return, Rowan's place at her side, the public challenge to Cassian, the fracture with other pack members, and the sacrifice that redeems and claims their bond. The first thing Mira noticed was how ordinary the morning smelled. The same wet earth and baking bread, the same goat-sour tang of the market and the sweat of wolves polishing leather. Ordinary, and therefore dangerous. The week since the full moon unspooled like a slow unzipping. Small rituals, tighter gazes, the pack testing the meter of her patience with the curiosity of a tide. But the moon's work in her did not end with the moon itself. It had settled into the bones and warmed the lungs. She woke now with a clarity that made small things feel inevitable. The gala, the exile, the learning with Rowan, each had been a stroke that shaped her into an outline she could finally see. Rowan was awake before her, as he always was, moving like a silent carpenter through their small, borrowed cabin on the edge of the Vale. He had woven simple curtains from salvaged linen to block the mornings that were too sharp, and his hands were a map of calluses and ink. He looked up when she moved, and the look he gave her was not pity and not triumph, but something stitched of both. the steady light of a man who had watched a strange thing grow. "You're ready," he said, and it wasn't a question. She made tea with hands as steady as if they had always known this temperature and those clumsy jars. The steam rose and painted her face, and she thought for a strange second of the gala lanterns, how light could both flatter and reveal. She did not tell Rowan what she planned in precise terms. There were things riskier than words. But she had decided, after nights of weighing shame and the taste of the lake on her tongue, that she would not disappear into a narrative built to make others comfortable. She would not be the lesson. She would be a solution the pack could not file into neat old laws. "How will you begin?" Rowan asked finally. Not because he needed to know steps so he could act as a human sword, but because questions were his way of being close. He had no claim to her that law would honor. His claim was private, and therefore painfully real. She took the cup to the window and let the morning spill across the rim. "With story," she said, "with truth, and with the kinds of demonstrations they can't misunderstand." Rowan's face softened. "Will you let me come?" "Yes," she said, and the word landed like a promise on both their mouths. They walked to the vale together, and the path felt like a cord they had both been tightening. The wolves along the way regarded them with an assortment of looks, curiosity, suspicion, and in some older faces, the small ember of remembered kindness. Cassian's banners were in the square, not because he needed to declare dominion, but because spectacle pleased him. The air smelled metallic and expectant. Children edged closer like little predators. Mira felt the press of so many eyes and let herself be as visible as the morning. The Elder Council had convened in the open ring where disputes were settled and where proclamations were made. They had invited, by custom and by threat, those who had a legal right to be present. Mira's entrance sent the younger wolves whispering. Cassian lounged at the circle center with the casual command of a man accustomed to being the arc of a story. He came forward to meet her with a smile that still felt like polished iron. "You have an audience," he said. "And you have a law book," she returned. "Let's see which one will be turned." Cassian's grin was thin. "You will not undo centuries with a single song, Mira." She let his words fall. "No," she said, "I will not undo centuries, but I will ask the pack to remember what we promised to be." It was a slow act, not a shout. She began by telling a story. Not the raw tale of the gala, not the bleeding memory that would have made people look away, but the story of what an Omega could be when the pack's old assumptions were held up to sunlight. She told them about the night at the lake and the sound that had returned, about the way frost melted in her path when she called softly, and the way a frightened doe had stopped to stand within the ring of her voice. Her speech was not a claim of ownership so much as a mapping. Here are things we have forgotten how to see. Here is proof that the moon moves in ways we cannot yet measure. The crowd listened, and in listening they were involuntary witnesses. Some rolled their eyes, some sat straighter, some furrowed brows until the skin between their eyes became a ridge. Cassian kept his face a mask. He was an alpha in a skin that youthful wolves mistook for invincibility. But under the mask there was the old human calculation of a leader who saw that his tale might be recast. "When you talk of proofs," he said finally, "we have to be sure they do not endanger the pack. Power without governance invites predators." Mira nodded. "Governance," she said, "must be for the protection of all, not the preservation of spectacle. I ask for rules that recognize capacity. I ask the council not to speak for me in the language that erases me." "It is not up to the council to interpret power as you would like," Cassian answered, and his words were a net cast wide. "We must maintain structure." "And structure cannot be a cage," Mira said. She felt the current in her as a thread at the base of her throat, warm and patient. If an omega can call the moon in ways we do not expect, then our laws should be expanded. Not to make omegas rulers, only safe. Not to make us equal by force, but to remove cruel practices that are about proving dominance rather than survival. The elder who chaired the circle looked like a carved thing, old and unafraid of moss. He had led through years when choices measured life in long increments. His eyes traveled the circle, and then, with the wary caution of someone who had seen empires folded into dust, he said, "A demonstration of safety? Something public?" "Yes," Mira said, "a demonstration, and then a mediation. Let me show you what I have learned. Let me perform on the land and under the moon in a way that cannot be reduced to spectacle. Then we will speak about binding laws." Cassian's laugh came out like a rasp. "You ask for the very thing you claimed would break you, publicity." "It is different now, because I will be the narrator," she said. "I will not kneel and say thank you. I will show how the moon's current can be a force for the pack's well-being." The council debated with a slowness that felt like a tide deliberating in its mind. Some argued for immediate containment, others for cautious permission. Old alliances creaked. Rowan watched from the edge, a human in a ring of fangs, and his presence unsettled traditionalists more than Mira's claims. He had no legal voice, but he had been her steward in the weeks of learning, and his blunt loyalty mattered. "We will grant you a demonstration," the elder finally said, "but not without safeguards. The demonstration will be under observation. There will be watchers who will mediate and record effects. If anything threatens the pack, we end it." It was more than nothing. It was both a rope and a noose. Mira accepted because it made the pack listen in a way talk had not. She staggered inward, by intention and design, toward a new shape. That night, the valley gathered at the east ridge, where winds hung clean and the moon was a thin, patient coin in the sky. The watchers were chosen for their temperance. An elder, 2 betas known for their fairness, and a young alpha from the neighboring Riverhold, who carried the reputation of being less theatrical than Cassian, and therefore less dangerous to the balance. They took their places like judges at an old trial. Cassian stood among them with arms folded, the corners of his mouth a human apology for his insecurity. Rowan stood behind Mira, his fingers braided like small comforts. She felt his presence as a ballast. The pack's breathing circled like an invisible fence. Children hovered at the edges of the adults, and the young wolves googled for the drama they wanted to own. When it came time, Mira stepped into the light of the moon and did not hesitate. She breathed slow. She remembered the lake, the call, the sound like a bell in a cave. She could feel the house of her grandmother's hands on the bones of her wrists, teaching a posture of survival that had become, now, a scaffold for her strength. She lowered her head, and then, as if following a map only she could read, she called. The sound rose clear and true, and did the most unromantic thing it had done. It organized the night. The wind cooled and rearranged itself. An old thorn bush straightened as if hearing its name. A fox, wary and curious, stepped into view. For the watchers, this was the first undeniable thing. The world responded where once it would have been indifferent. Mira's voice shaped nuance into law. The moon's power hummed through her not as a crown, but as a channel. It asked for intention. She let it carry warmth where frost had been, eased a trapped fawn's breath, and set a small fire in a hearth that had been difficult to light. These were not miracles grand enough to overturn mountains. They were domestic, humane, and therefore impossible to weaponize easily. The watchers nodded slowly, the elder more thoughtful than the young alpha had expected. Cassian's face changed imperceptibly. The alpha in him registered a risk as well as a possibility. In the end, it was the children who reacted first, a broadening curiosity that tilted the ring away from ridicule and toward wonder. If youth could see without the immediate need to conquer, then perhaps there was room for a new narrative, if the pack could be persuaded. The demonstration ended with applause that felt almost instinctive. But applause in the Vale was not a revolution. It was a beginning of conversation. The elder called the circle to discussion, and Mira presented proposals, small but radical. Codified protections for omegas against public humiliations, protocols for recognition of rare lunar currents, and a process to integrate them into the pack's defense, and, perhaps most controversially to men like Cassian, a council seat for an omega representative selected by the omegas themselves. Cassian's mouth thinned. "This seems an expansion for the sake of novelty," he said, which was to say he believed in tradition so hard he mistook it for truth. "It is an expansion for the sake of our survival," Mira shot back. "We are stronger when we put weapons where they belong, in our defenses, in our agreements with neighbors, not in the repression of our own." The debate that followed was long and volatile. Cassian argued with a charm that was widely admired. He could make sentences seem like law. Rowan offered testimony, human and thus imperfect, but honest. He spoke of the nights had watched Mira call the moon and the way the land changed. He spoke of the way humiliation had reshaped her into a creature both terrible and necessary. His words were not wise in political terms, but they had the narrowness of truth. "I don't understand all of it," he said, eyes on the elder, "but I've seen enough that I don't want this to be crushed into fear." It was the young alpha who surprised them all. He asked for a delay, not because he opposed change, but because he feared the pack might fracture if the old guard were forced to accept everything at once. "Change that is too fast is recoil's best friend," he said. "Let us try the new for a season. If it helps, we keep it. If it hurts, we adapt." The elder agreed. It was the kind of compromise that soothed a community and frustrated a revolutionary. Mira accepted it because she was tired of the longer fights that demanded sacrifice she could not afford. She wanted change that would keep people alive, not whipped into purity. Rowan squeezed her hand when the vote was called. The measure passed by a narrow margin. The crowd dispersed with the murmur of conversations that were no longer all about mockery. Cassian remained a figure of elegance and containment. He had not been defeated. No one in the council had sought to throw him from power. They had simply agreed to widen the map by increments he could not easily control. He approached Mira Lecter alone, and for once there was no script for his face. "You have made trouble," he said, and the accusation had the faint shape of respect under its edge. "I have given the pack a choice," Mira answered. "It chose to try." He studied her a moment, and in the depths of his eyes she saw something new. The recognition that the world did not bend only one way. "Do not wish to watch," he said. "Old rules are a kind of armor." "I do not wish to strip you of armor," she said. "I only ask that you stop using people to shine it." He was silent, and whatever retort had been forming left unspoken. It was not an apology and not quite a truce. It was an acknowledgement of a space opened, fearful and thin, but a space nonetheless. The weeks after the vote were a test. The pack shifted as if an old coat had been taken off to dry. Some seams held, others frayed. There were wolves who clung to old forms because they were comfortable. Others leaned toward the new with the fearless curiosity of youth. Rowan continued to be a presence at Mira's side. He had no formal recognition beyond the private care he gave. But the elder and some of the more progressive betas began to tolerate him, if not always accept him. It was enough for the work of mending. Mira's days were crowded with small, necessary tasks, mediating disputes that now took her presence into account, teaching young Omegas how to hold their voices with intention, and working with watchmen to craft the protocols for demonstrations that could prove a power's benefit without making a spectacle of suffering. She spent late evenings at the Library of the Vale, an old building with the kind of dust that remembers names, consulting with scholars and elders, reading what little existed in the way of records about lunar currents and omegas who had been catalysts for change. Each page offered both history and a quiet companionship. They were not the only ones to have sought meaning in the moon's language. Cassian's shadow changed its angles around her slowly. He came to challenge her on the margins, on decisions that tasted like threat to him, but not always with cruelty. Sometimes he argued like a man who tested an opponent in order to learn where his own weaknesses lay. The pack's contours shifted to accommodate them both, and with each narrow, careful negotiation, the idea of power as monolith weakened. And then came the night of the border raid. The Riverhold scouts had reported movement 2 nights prior, an increase in predator activity across the eastern ridges. A scent had been carried in the wind, and the elders were quick to suspect humans or other packs testing the Vale's new edge. Cassian sent the trolls. Mira volunteered to stand on the ridge to see where the tide had been turned, arguing that a presence could sometimes deter a predator. The choice was practical and symbolic. For the first time, she stood not as an offering, but as a defender. Rowan rode at her side despite the elder's nervous glances. "You could stay back," he had said, but his own body chose proximity to danger in the way of people who loved flawed and brave things. The night was a bruise of stars when they first saw smoke on the horizon. Wolves moved like shadow-stitched dancers across the ridge, lights flicking like beacons. Then the sound came, more human than beast, the clang of metal and the shout of a voice that was not the Vale's. A small band had crossed the border, testing tolerance, whether to skirmish or to take. Chaos is a teacher with sharp teeth. The Vale's hunters met the attackers with quick organizational violence that was precise and terraced like the movement of a well-disciplined tide. Mira found herself in the center of an assault that smelled of iron and fear. She could have stayed held back, but the moon's pull in her did not allow passive witness. She stepped forward and used the current she had learned to focus care in immediate ways, directing a wounded man to a hollow that would staunch bleeding, coaxing a frightened foal into a safer thicket, calling a small flame outward to draw smoke away from people suffocating in the confusion. In the midst of the fight, a man with a blade too bright for his armor lunged toward Rowan. Without thinking, Mira threw herself between them. The blade caught the side of her arm, a clean line that tasted like copper. Pain was a bright, hot thing, and the current in her seized the wound like a compass. She called not to the sky, but to the body. Let the laceration knit, let the blood settle into something that could be withdrawn and returned as repair. The world tilted then. The wound stitched with a stitch that was not physician's carefulness, but a moonlit weaving of intent. Rowan grabbed the man's wrist and felled him with a motion that was swift and full of shock. He looked at Mira with wild gratitude and a dawning understanding of what she could do. Later, when the attackers had retreated and the Vale's watch had tightened the seams of their border, Cassian came to Mira by the chest-high stones that marked the ridge edge. He smelled of smoke and leather and exertion. His face had a bruise of something that was almost, though he would never say it aloud, respect. "You put yourself in the line of a blade," he said. "You were busy doing your job," she replied, "where job was everything and nothing." He was quiet a moment. "You could be dangerous," he said, the admission both a threat and a compliment. She met his gaze and saw there not a single man, but an entire system that had been forced to adjust. So could compassion be, she said, and in war it is often what saves us. He made a small, almost grudging nod. Good answer. For the record, our scouts reported you saved several lives tonight. Then keep their names safe, she replied, because naming could be a way of owning, and she did not want to be owned. The raid tightened the Veil's respect into a series of small, irreversible changes. The Elder moved to codify the protections they had discussed. The watch protocols were refined with input from Mira and Rowan. Young Omegas came to Mira not with questions of begging, but with questions about how to call the moon in service, how to mend, how to warn, how to use tenderness as an instrument of defense. Rowan's place in the Veil softened from tolerated oddity to essential human aid. The older wolves were not always comfortable, but in the quiet, long nights when the pack stitched wounds and counted names, he was there, an ordinary hand that refused to be small. He and Mira found a rhythm that was the opposite of performance. It was the small, stubborn thing. He made her tea after long patrols, she wrapped his bruised knuckles with careful cloth when he returned from tracking. They spoke in the modest way of people who do not need grand speeches to mark love. A call, a touch, a silence shared. Their relationship did not sweep into canon as a miracle, it seeped. There were nights when they argued, about risk, about the nature of duty, about whether it was possible for a human to truly understand a wolf's self. There were nights when no one else was awake, and they sat with the sound of the Veil breathing, and their hands found each other like tools. Mira's own path did not end in coronation, but in quiet empowerment. She was never alpha, not by law, and probably not by the thing that made alphas. She was, instead, the axis of a new law, one that recognized capacity over role, that built mechanisms to prevent spectacle and humiliation, that measured power not by dominion, but by usefulness to the common good. Omegas gained the right to refuse public rituals that could be used to shame. A process was set for anyone with unusual lunar currents to be integrated into the pack's defense plans or research. And a seat at the council, populated by an elected Omega and a rotating human steward, was promised as an experiment. People who had once laughed at her now learned her name like a new song. There were wolves who continued to be cruel because cruelty had been a religion for them. They retreated to older packs that matched their taste for spectacle. But the Veil moved forward in a way that made room for people who had previously had to hide. One afternoon in late spring, when the snow had finally surrendered and the meadow stank of new green, Mira and Rowan stood on the same ridge where her demonstration had been held. Children played in the distance, and the central square smelled of bread and a new sort of peace. The Elder walked by, slower but steady, and nodded at Mira with the kind of affection that was earned in full. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said, and it was an old man's honesty to speak a truth that had no audience but a single ear. Mira's chest warmed in a way that was not simply triumph. Her life had been braided of losses and gifts, of the humiliation that had cracked her open and the learning that had let the moon pour through. She thought of the small cabin where Rowan read old maps, and of the children who now had a folder of rights. She thought, impossibly, of Cassian, no longer enemy, sometimes ally, always a man who would stand to both challenge and protect the pack's coherence. Rowan slipped a hand into hers. It was an ordinary motion, almost domestic, a clasp above a kitchen table, and yet it felt like the seal on a treaty they had shaped themselves. "You changed the way they see themselves," he said softly, not wanting to make too grand a claim because their life was stitched of small truths. "And you saved my life with a brute's hand and an ordinary heart," she answered, and they laughed in a way that scattered the morning. There were promises they did not make, no grand declarations, no guarantees that prejudice would end overnight. But there were agreements. To keep pressing, to defend the possibility that a person could be both vulnerable and dangerous without contradiction, to allow love that did not fit neatly into pack law to be recognized in practice even if not always in statute. Rowan and Mira did not expect everyone to follow. They expected to do the work anyway. Years later, when the Veil had new maps and older stories revised their angles, children would run down stones and speak of the Moonfall Gala as a cautionary tale, and of Mira as the woman who turned a humiliation into a horizon. Some versions of the story would exaggerate, turning the lake into a scene of miraculous conversion. Others would flatten it into a utilitarian lesson. The truth would be smaller and therefore more human. A woman who had been pushed to the edge of herself and learned in the small, exact hours of practice how to use the moon as a tool and a refuge. A human who refused to look away when cruelty walked past. A pack that learned that protection did not mean eradication of difference, but recognition and integration. On a late night when the moon was a fat coin hung low and the Veil breathed like a body in sleep, Mira walked to the lake. Rowan followed, the night air soft on his face. The surface of the water held the moon like a lantern. She sat on the bank and let the sound rise, a note that had once been a tremor and now was a clear bell. The current flowed around her like a memory that had finally come to rest. Rowan sat beside her, his shoulder against hers, not claiming but supporting. She felt the pull of power inside her not as a crown, but as an echo chamber for compassion and strength. It had not made her less human, it had made her more possible. "Do you think we changed anything?" he asked into the night. "Some things," she said. "Some things for those who kept listening." He put his arm around her, and she let herself rest into the small, ordinary gravity of a man who loved her in ways that were not easy to categorize. The moon's light pooled on the lake and making a way, and in that luminous thread, Mira heard the future as something soft and ongoing. The steady work of living that requires courage not because it is heroic, but because it is continuous. She lifted her face to the moon and did not ask it to fight her battles. She asked for nothing grand. She asked only that the world be given the chance to keep evolving, and that the Veil remember how small cruelties accumulate into systems. The moon hummed a soft answer, and the sound they made together was not a claim of dominion, but a vow to keep believing in change. Awkward, imperfect, stubborn as roots. In the Veil, life stitched on. Children learned new laws and old songs. Cassian kept his station, but with a narrower margin for spectacle. The council included a woman who had once been called weak and who had refused the name until she could define herself. Rowan and Mira built a life that fit between human and wolf, domestic and wild, a life that was not named in any laws, but experienced in the slow work of good mornings and steady hands. The last image was small, Mira at the lake, the moon across her face, Rowan's fingers in hers. The world moved around them with the sort of ordinary persistence that few stories make room for. The grinding, necessary, beautiful business of not being cruel to one another. In that ordinary persistence, she had found something like power, the ability to survive humiliation, to transform it, and to keep standing so others could find a place to stand with them. The moon watched, impartial and gracious, and the Veil, for all its old aches, breathed on into a future that was, finally, a little less cruel and a lot more hopeful.